The blood-red horizon painted the Montana sky as Margaret Foster stood on the porch of the only home she'd ever known, clutching a swaddled infant to her chest. Her father's words still rang in her ears, sharp as the crack of a bullwhip. "No daughter of mine will bring shame to this family by nursing another woman's bastard. You made your choice. Now get out." It was the spring of 1876, and at 22 years old, Margaret found herself homeless with a child that wasn't hers, but one she couldn't abandon. 3 days ago, a half-dead Cherokee woman had collapsed at their doorstep, her newborn son barely clinging to life. Margaret had nursed the infant while her father fetched the doctor, but by the time they returned, the mother had passed. The tiny boy survived, and something in Margaret's heart had opened like a desert flower after rain. "Fine, then," she whispered to the morning air, hoisting her single bag of belongings. "We'll make our own way, little one." The town of Silver Creek wasn't large, but it was the only civilization for 50 miles in any direction. As Margaret walked down the main street, she felt the weight of stares from shopkeepers and townspeople. News traveled fast in small places, and her father, Jedediah Foster, was an elder at the church and owned the town's only sawmill. His judgment carried weight. "Miss Foster." The voice came from behind her, and Margaret turned to find Mrs. Abernathy, the widow who ran the general store. "Heard what happened. It ain't right, what your pa did." Margaret adjusted the baby in her arms. "He made his decision, Mrs. Abernathy. I made mine. Where will you go?" "I don't know yet," Margaret admitted, trying to keep her voice steady. "I thought perhaps the boarding house. Gertrude won't take you in, dear. Your pa's already been there." The older woman's eyes held genuine sympathy. "Says anyone who gives you shelter will lose his business." Margaret swallowed hard. Her father's influence was something she'd known would be a barrier, but she hadn't expected how quickly he'd moved to cut off her options. "Then I'll go to the next town," she said with more confidence than she felt. Eagle Pass was 15 miles away, too far to walk with an infant, especially one as fragile as this. "You'll do no such thing." Mrs. Abernathy glanced around nervously. "My sister has a place about 3 miles out of town. It ain't much, but there's a roof. She's been away visiting her daughter in Denver these past 2 months. I'll loan you my wagon." "I can't ask you to. You didn't ask. I offered." The older woman reached out to touch the baby's cheek. "What's his name, anyhow?" Margaret looked down at the sleeping infant. "I've been calling him Joshua, after my brother who passed." "Good strong name." Mrs. Abernathy nodded. "Wait here. I'll bring the wagon around back so folks won't see." 20 minutes later, Margaret found herself heading down a winding dirt road, Mrs. Abernathy's elderly mare pulling the small wagon at a leisurely pace. Joshua slept against her chest, his tiny heart beating against her own. "We'll be all right," she whispered to him. "I promise." The cabin that belonged to Mrs. Abernathy's sister was indeed small, but it was solid and clean. A single room with a stone fireplace, a bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, and cupboards along one wall. Outside was a small garden gone wild with weeds, a chicken coop that housed 3 aging hens, and a water pump that, thankfully, still worked. Margaret spent her first day cleaning, washing the dusty bedding in the stream behind the property, and making an inventory of what supplies Mrs. Abernathy had provided. There was enough food for perhaps a week, some firewood and basic necessities. The older woman had promised to visit when she could with more provisions, but Margaret knew she'd need to find a way to support herself and Joshua soon. That night, as she sat by the fire nursing Joshua with a mixture of goat's milk and thin gruel the best she could manage without a wet nurse, Margaret allowed herself to cry for the first time. She wept for the mother who had died, for her own mother who'd passed 5 years earlier, for the family that had rejected her, and for the uncertain future ahead. "But not for you," she told Joshua, wiping her tears away. "Never for you. You're my blessing, not my burden." By the 3rd day, Margaret had established a routine. She would rise with the sun, tend to Joshua, gather eggs from the hens, work in the garden for an hour, then walk to the stream to wash clothes or bathe. In the afternoons, she'd sew thankfully. She'd brought her needlework supplies or read from the Bible that Mrs. Abernathy had included among the provisions. It was during one of these afternoon sessions, with Joshua sleeping in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a wooden crate lined with blankets, that Margaret heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Her heart raced with fear had her father found her. Had he sent someone to bring her home, but only if she surrendered Joshua? Placing her sewing aside, Margaret moved to the window, peering cautiously through the glass. A rider was approaching, tall in the saddle, but it wasn't her father or anyone she recognized from town. This man wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, a leather vest over a blue shirt, and had the unmistakable bearing of someone who lived in the saddle, a cowboy. Margaret quickly checked on Joshua, still sleeping soundly, then stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind her. She wished she had a weapon. Even her father's old shotgun would have provided some comfort, but all she had was her wits and a determined spirit. "Can I help you?" she called as the rider drew closer. The man slowed his horse, a handsome chestnut quarter horse, and tipped his hat back to reveal a face weathered by sun and wind, yet surprisingly young, perhaps no more than 30. His eyes, a clear blue that reminded Margaret of summer skies, assessed her with equal parts curiosity and caution. "Afternoon, madam," he said, his voice deep and accented with what Margaret recognized as a Texas drawl. "I'm looking for Beatrice Abernathy. This is her place, ain't it?" Margaret relaxed slightly. "It is, but she's away visiting family. I'm staying here temporarily." The man nodded, seemingly unsurprised by this information. "Name's Wyatt Harrington. I work for the Double R Ranch up north a ways. Mrs. Abernathy contracted with us to deliver a side of beef once a month, paid in advance for the whole summer." Oh, Margaret hadn't known about this arrangement. "I'm afraid she didn't mention it to me. No reason she would." Wyatt dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent most of his life on horseback. He was taller than she'd initially thought, standing well over 6 feet. "I can come back another time if that's better." From inside the cabin, Joshua began to cry. Margaret hesitated, torn between the immediate need to tend to the baby and the unexpected visitor. "Sounds like you've got your hands full," Wyatt said, offering a small smile. "I don't mean to intrude. I'll just leave this with you and be on my way." He moved to his horse and untied a burlap-wrapped package from behind the saddle. "No, please wait." Margaret found herself not wanting him to leave just yet. It had been days since she'd spoken to anyone besides Mrs. Abernathy, and the isolation was beginning to weigh on her. "Let me just see to the baby. You're welcome to draw water from the pump if you're thirsty." Without waiting for his response, she hurried inside to Joshua, who was red-faced and hungry. She lifted him from the cradle, whispering soothing words as she settled into the rocking chair to feed him. Through the window, she could see Wyatt leading his horse to the water trough, removing his hat to reveal thick brown hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. By the time Joshua had eaten and fallen back asleep, Wyatt had unloaded the beef and was sitting on the porch steps, whittling a small piece of wood with a pocket knife. He stood when Margaret emerged. "He's settled now," she said, feeling strangely self-conscious. "Thank you for your patience." "No trouble at all." Wyatt tucked the knife away. "Cute little fellow, your husband around?" Margaret stiffened at the question. "I'm not married, Mr. Harrington." If he was scandalized by this revelation, he didn't show it. Instead, he nodded as if this explained something. "That why you're out here alone. Town folk can be mighty judgmental. It's complicated." Margaret wasn't sure how much to share with this stranger. "Joshua isn't mine by birth. His mother died shortly after he was born, and She hesitated, then decided on the truth. "I couldn't let him go to an orphanage. My father disagreed with my decision." Wyatt's expression remained neutral, but his eyes softened. "That's a mighty brave thing you did, Miss Foster, Margaret Foster, Miss Foster." He repeated her name with a respectful nod. "World needs more folks willing to put a child's needs above their own comfort." His words, so different from the condemnation she'd expected, brought unexpected tears to Margaret's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, unwilling to appear weak before this stranger. "Would you like some coffee, Mr. Harrington? It's the least I can offer for your trouble bringing the beef." That'd be mighty nice, thank you. He followed her inside, removing his hat as he entered the small cabin. As Margaret busied herself with the coffee pot at the fireplace, she felt Wyatt's eyes taking in the modest surroundings. "It's not much," she said, feeling defensive. "It's a good solid cabin," he replied. "Needs some work on the roof before winter, though." "Noticed some loose shingles when I rode up," Margaret sighed. "Add it to the list. I'm afraid I don't know the first thing about roof repair." Wyatt accepted the cup of coffee she offered, their fingers brushing momentarily in the exchange. "I could take a look at it before I go." "Wouldn't take more than an hour to fix what I saw." "I couldn't ask you to do that." "Didn't ask, offered." He smiled, and Margaret was struck by how it transformed his weathered face, bringing a boyish charm to his features. "Besides, can't have a lady and a baby sleeping under a leaky roof." Margaret wanted to refuse. Pride dictated she should, but practicality won out. "That's very kind, thank you." They sat at the small table, drinking coffee in companionable silence for a few minutes. Margaret found herself studying Wyatt surreptitiously. His hands were large and calloused, his forearms corded with muscle visible where he'd rolled up his sleeves. A small scar ran along his jawline, and crow's feet had begun to form at the corners of his eyes, evidence of a life lived outdoors. "How long have you worked at the Double R?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Going on 5 years now. Started as a regular hand, worked my way up to foreman last winter." There was quiet pride in his voice. "Boss is getting on in years, looking to step back some." "You enjoy it, ranch work?" Wyatt considered the question seriously. "Most days, it's honest work. Hard, but there's something about watching the sun rise over open country that makes the aches worthwhile." He took another sip of coffee. "What about you? What did you do before all this?" "I helped my father with the books at his sawmill." "Taught reading at the church on Sundays. Nothing very exciting, I'm afraid." "Nothing wrong with that. World needs teachers." The conversation flowed easily after that. Wyatt told her about growing up in Texas, drifting north after the war, finding work where he could until settling at the Double R. Margaret shared stories of her childhood in Silver Creek, her mother's illness, the responsibility she'd shouldered helping raise her younger siblings. When Joshua awoke again, fussing softly, Wyatt rose to his feet. "Better see to that roof while the light's good. You tend to the little one." For the next hour, Margaret moved between caring for Joshua and watching through the window as Wyatt worked on the roof. He moved with confidence, repairing loose shingles and sealing gaps with materials he'd found in the small shed behind the cabin. When he finally climbed down, his shirt was damp with sweat, but he looked satisfied. "Should hold tight now," he said, washing his hands at the pump. "Next time I'm out this way, I'll bring some proper supplies and give it a more thorough going over." "Next time," Margaret echoed, surprised. "Well, I'll be back in a month with the next delivery, won't I?" His eyes met hers, and something in his gaze made Margaret's heart beat a little faster. "Unless you'd rather I didn't come." "No," she said quickly. "I mean, yes, of course, the delivery, that would be fine." Wyatt's mouth twitched with amusement at her flustered response. "Might bring some extra supplies too if there's anything particular you need." Margaret thought of her dwindling provisions, pride warred with necessity. "I can pay," she insisted. "I have some savings." "Never suggested otherwise, Miss Foster." He donned his hat again, tipping it slightly. "Just offering to save you a trip to town." As he mounted his horse, Wyatt paused, looking down at her with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. "You know, what you're doing taking in that baby when no one else would, that's exactly the kind of woman this country needs more of. Don't let anyone tell you different." With that, he turned his horse and rode away, leaving Margaret standing on the porch, Joshua in her arms, watching until horse and rider disappeared over the ridge. "Well," she said to the baby, "that was unexpected." The days that followed took on a new rhythm. Margaret still rose with the sun and tended to Joshua and the modest homestead, but now she found herself looking forward to Wyatt's promised return. She told herself it was merely the prospect of company and supplies that excited her, but in quiet moments she admitted the truth. Something about the cowboy had sparked an interest she'd never felt before. 2 weeks after Wyatt's visit, Mrs. Abernathy arrived with a wagon full of supplies and news from town. Your pa's still telling everyone you've gone to stay with cousins in Kansas City, the older woman reported as she helped Margaret stock the shelves. Saving face, I suppose, but folks are talking. That Reverend Miller had a whole sermon about fallen women last Sunday. Margaret winced but continued organizing the flour and sugar. And what do people say about Joshua? Mixed opinions there. Some think you're foolish, others admire what you did, Mrs. Abernathy paused, watching Margaret's face carefully. Word is your pa's considering coming to find you, bring you home without the baby, of course. A cold fear settled in Margaret's stomach. He wouldn't separate us, I won't let him. That's why I'm telling you, be prepared. The older woman hesitated. There's something else. I ran into Wyatt Harrington in town yesterday. He asked after you. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. Did he? I mean, he mentioned he'd be bringing another delivery next month. Mrs. Abernathy's eyes twinkled knowingly. Is that all he said? Because he seemed mighty concerned about whether you had everything you needed out here. He fixed the roof, Margaret admitted. It was very kind of him. Wyatt's a good man, known him since he came to these parts, keeps to himself mostly, but honest as the day is long. She patted Margaret's hand. Wouldn't hurt to have a friend like that, especially now. After Mrs. Abernathy left, Margaret found herself mulling over the woman's words as she bathed Joshua in a small tin tub. The baby was growing stronger every day, his tiny features becoming more defined. He had his mother's dark eyes and copper skin, a beautiful child who deserved far more than the harsh judgment of narrow-minded townspeople. We'll be fine, she assured him as she dried him with a soft cloth. We have friends, more than I realized. 3 days later, Margaret was hanging laundry on the line when she heard horses approaching, plural more than one rider. Her pulse quickened with alarm. Quickly gathering Joshua from his basket in the shade, she retreated toward the cabin, ready to bar the door if necessary. Relief flooded through her when she recognized Wyatt's chestnut horse in the lead. He wasn't alone, though. A second rider accompanied him, an older man with silver hair and a neat beard, riding a dappled gray. Miss Foster, Wyatt called, raising his hand in greeting as they approached. Hope we're not intruding. Not at all, she replied, stepping forward again. You're earlier than expected, Mr. Harrington. Wyatt dismounted, then helped his companion down from his horse. This is Mr. Richard Redmond, owner of the Double R, my boss. The older man stepped forward, leaning on a walking stick but standing straight-shouldered. Miss Foster, pleased to make your acquaintance. Wyatt here hasn't stopped talking about the brave young lady living out here alone with a baby. Margaret glanced at Wyatt, who had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. It's hardly brave, Mr. Redmond, just necessary. Necessary things often require the most courage, the old rancher replied, his eyes kind. May I? He gestured toward Joshua. Margaret hesitated only briefly before tilting the baby so Mr. Redmond could see his face. The older man smiled softly. Handsome little fellow, reminds me of my youngest grandson. He looked up at Margaret with unexpected warmth. Wyatt tells me you're good with figures and reading, that true? Confused by the question, Margaret nodded. Yes, I helped my father with his accounts for years. Good, good. Mr. Redmond exchanged a look with Wyatt. You see, Miss Foster, I find myself in need of someone with just those skills. My eyesight isn't what it was, and the ranch books are getting beyond me. Wyatt suggested you might be interested in taking on the work. Margaret blinked in surprise. Me, but I have Joshua to care for, and I'm miles from your ranch. We've thought of that, Wyatt interjected. There's a cottage on the property used to be the old foreman's place before I took the new cabin. It's sitting empty, and it's twice the size of this place. You'd have privacy, but be close enough to help with the books a few hours each day. And there are women at the ranch, the cook's wife, a couple of hands' wives who could help with the baby when needed. Margaret's mind raced. The offer was unexpected and generous, too generous. Why would you do this for me? You barely know me, mister. Redmond leaned on his stick, studying her with shrewd eyes. Miss Foster, good help is hard to find in these parts, especially someone literate and skilled with numbers. This isn't charity, it's business. You'd be paid fair wages for fair work. And Wyatt added quietly, you'd be further from town, less chance of unwanted visitors. Margaret understood immediately what he meant. Mrs. Abernathy must have told him about her father's potential plans. Could I think about it? She asked, needing time to process this sudden change in circumstances. Of course, Mr. Redmond agreed. Wyatt will be back in 2 days with a wagon if you decide to accept. If not, no harm done. He tipped his hat. Now, I believe I'll rest in the shade a moment before we head back. Long ride for these old bones. As the older man made his way to the bench under the oak tree, Wyatt stepped closer to Margaret, lowering his voice. It's a good opportunity, Margaret. The ranch is like its own little town, 20 hands and their families. No one would judge you there. Plenty of the men have taken in orphans after the war or the fever outbreaks. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and Margaret found she liked the way it sounded in his Texas drawl. Did you arrange this because you're worried about my father? Wyatt's expression grew serious. Partly, Mrs. Abernathy mentioned he might come looking, and I know men like that don't give up easily when their pride's at stake. He glanced at Joshua, sleeping peacefully in Margaret's arms. But mostly because that little one deserves a safe place to grow up, and you deserve a fresh start where people value you for who you are, not what they think you've done wrong. Margaret studied his face, searching for ulterior motives but finding only sincerity. And what do you get out of this arrangement, Mr. Harrington? A slow smile spread across his face. Well, for one thing, the boss's books will finally make sense, and for another, he paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. I reckon I'd sleep better knowing you and the little one were safe. 2 days later, Margaret stood on the porch of the cabin, her bags packed and Joshua securely wrapped against her chest. When she'd told Mrs. Abernathy of the offer, the older woman had practically pushed her out the door. It's Providence, clear as day, she declared. The Lord works in mysterious ways, and sometimes those ways look like a handsome cowboy offering you a better life. Now, as the sound of an approaching wagon reached her ears, Margaret felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. Was she making the right choice? What if the ranch wasn't the haven Wyatt had described? The wagon appeared around the bend, Wyatt handling the reins of 2 sturdy draft horses. He dressed more formally than she'd seen before, a clean white shirt under his vest, his hat brushed free of dust. The sight of him made her heart beat a little faster. Morning, Miss Foster, he called, drawing the wagon to a halt. Beautiful day for a new beginning. The drive to the Double R took most of the day, winding through valleys and across streams that Margaret had never seen despite living in the territory her entire life. Wyatt pointed out landmarks as they traveled, telling stories of the land and its history with a knowledge that spoke of deep respect for the country. There it is, he said finally, as they crested a hill in the late afternoon. The Double R. Below them stretched a vast ranch, centered around a large 2-story house built of sturdy logs and stone. Outbuildings, corrals, and smaller cabins dotted the surrounding area, smoke rising from several chimneys. In the distance, cattle grazed on green pastures that seemed to stretch to the mountains on the horizon. It's beautiful, Margaret breathed. Wyatt's smile held pride. Wait till you see it at sunrise, like God painted the sky just for us. As they approached the main complex, people emerged from buildings to watch their arrival. Margaret felt self-conscious under their curious gazes, but Wyatt seemed unconcerned. The cottage is just past those pines, he pointed. Thought we'd get you settled there first, before introducing you around. The cottage proved to be a charming 4-room structure with a proper kitchen, a sitting room with a stone fireplace, and 2 bedrooms. Someone had been there recently. The floors were swept, fresh linens were on the bed, and a fire was laid ready in the hearth. Mrs. Caldwell, that's the cook's wife, came up this morning to ready the place, Wyatt explained as he carried in Margaret's bags. She left some stew warming on the back of the stove, too. Margaret stood in the center of the sitting room, Joshua still sleeping against her chest, overwhelmed by the unexpected comfort of her new home. A rocking chair sat by the fire, a small bookshelf held several volumes, and curtains framed windows that let in the golden late afternoon light. "This is too much," she whispered. Wyatt set down her last bag and turned to her, his expression earnest. "It's exactly what you deserve, Margaret. A proper home." That evening, after Wyatt had gone and Margaret had fed Joshua and laid him in the actual crib that someone had thoughtfully provided, she sat in the rocking chair by the fire, reflecting on the rapid changes in her life. 1 month ago, she'd been the respectable daughter of a prominent citizen. Now she was an outcast who had taken in an orphan child and moved to a ranch where she knew almost no one. And yet, for the first time in years, she felt genuinely hopeful about what tomorrow might bring. The following weeks brought a new rhythm to Margaret's life. Each morning, she would care for Joshua, then walk the short distance to the main house where she would spend 2 hours working on the ranch's accounts. Mr. Redmond proved to be a fair and generous employer, often insisting she take breaks when Joshua needed attention. The ranch wives had welcomed her with surprising warmth. Mrs. Caldwell, a robust woman with 6 grown children of her own, had taken an immediate shine to Joshua, often volunteering to watch him while Margaret worked. Mrs. Peterson, wife of the stable master, had gifted her with hand-sewn baby clothes and practical advice on teething. Even the cowboys, rough men who spent most days in the saddle, would stop to make faces at Joshua when they passed Margaret on her walks. No one asked about Joshua's parentage or questioned Margaret's status as an unmarried woman caring for him. It was as if the ranch existed in its own world, with its own rules about what mattered. Honesty, hard work, and kindness ranked far above conventional propriety. Wyatt, busy with the spring cattle work, still made time to check on her daily. Sometimes it was just a brief visit on his way to or from the range. Other times he would bring small gifts, wildflowers he'd spotted while riding, a toy he'd carved for Joshua, fresh berries from a secret patch he knew. Margaret found herself looking forward to these visits with an eagerness that both thrilled and frightened her. It had been years since she'd allowed herself to think of romance, focused as she'd been on caring for her father's household after her mother's death. But there was something about Wyatt Harrington that awakened feelings she'd long suppressed. One evening, about a month after her arrival at the Double R, Wyatt appeared at her door just as she was putting Joshua down for the night. When she opened the door, she found him standing there looking uncharacteristically nervous, his hat in his hands. "Evening, Margaret," he said. "Hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," she replied, stepping back to let him in. "Joshua's just settled. Would you like some coffee?" "That'd be nice, thank you." He followed her into the kitchen, watching as she moved about preparing the pot. "Actually, I came to ask you something." Margaret turned, curious about his serious tone. "What is it?" "Saturday's the spring dance. Ranch tradition, everybody from miles around comes. Good food, music." He twisted his hat in his hands. "I was wondering if you might consider attending, with me." The invitation hung in the air between them. Margaret felt a flutter of excitement, quickly followed by anxiety. "A dance? I don't know, Wyatt. I haven't been to one since before my mother passed, and with Joshua, Mrs. Caldwell already offered to watch him, said you deserved an evening to yourself." He stepped closer. "You don't have to dance if you don't want to. Just thought you might enjoy the company, the music." Margaret hesitated. The prospect of an evening of normalcy, of joy, was tempting. But what would people say? She'd only just begun to feel accepted at the ranch. As if reading her thoughts, Wyatt continued softly, "No one there will judge you, Margaret, and if they try, they'll answer to me." The protectiveness in his voice warmed something inside her. "All right," she heard herself say, "I'd like that." His face broke into a smile that made her heart skip. "Saturday at 6 then, I'll come fetch you." Saturday arrived clear and warm, a perfect late spring day. Margaret spent the afternoon in a flutter of preparation, washing her hair and pressing her best dress, a blue cotton with white trim that she hadn't worn since leaving Silver Creek. Mrs. Caldwell arrived early to take charge of Joshua, cooing over him and shooing Margaret off to finish getting ready. "That cowboy's been pacing like a caged mountain lion all day," Mrs. Caldwell confided with a wink. Never seen Wyatt Harrington so worked up over anything that wasn't four-legged. Margaret blushed at the implication but couldn't deny the thrill that ran through her at the thought that Wyatt might be as nervous about the evening as she was. When he arrived, right on time, Margaret's breath caught at the sight of him. He'd clearly made an effort. His hair was neatly combed, his boots polished to a shine, and he wore a crisp white shirt with a black string tie under a well-fitted vest. He'd even trimmed his beard. "You look beautiful," he said when she opened the door, his eyes taking in her appearance with undisguised appreciation. "Thank you," she replied, feeling suddenly shy. "You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Harrington." His laugh eased some of the tension. "Hardly recognize myself. The boys had a good laugh watching me fuss with this tie." The dance was held in the large barn, which had been transformed for the occasion. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the swept floor. At one end, a makeshift stage held 5 musicians with fiddles, a banjo, and a piano that must have required significant effort to move from the main house. Long tables laden with food and drink lined one wall, and bales of hay had been arranged as seating around the perimeter. When Margaret and Wyatt entered, the barn was already filled with people, ranch hands and their families, neighbors from miles around, and even a few townsfolk from the nearest settlement. Conversations paused briefly as heads turned to observe the newcomers, but to Margaret's relief, the looks she received were merely curious, not judgmental. "Wyatt, you old dog," a burly cowboy approached, slapping Wyatt on the back. "Didn't believe the rumors that you were bringing a lady friend." He tipped his hat to Margaret. "Madam, pleasure to meet you. I'm Ben Wilson, known this reprobate since he couldn't rope a fence post." "Ignore him," Wyatt advised with a grin. "Ben's idea of charm is not stepping in manure before he talks to a lady." Margaret laughed, finding herself relaxing as Wyatt introduced her to more of his colleagues and their wives. There were too many names to remember at once, but everyone was welcoming, treating her as if she'd always been part of their community. When the music started in earnest, Wyatt turned to her with a questioning look. "Would you care to dance, Miss Foster?" Margaret hesitated only briefly. "I'd be delighted, Mr. Harrington, though I warn you it's been some time." "Don't you worry," he said, leading her to the floor. "Just follow my lead." To her surprise, Wyatt proved to be an excellent dancer, guiding her confidently through the lively reel. His hand at the small of her back was warm and sure, his steps precise despite his usual bow-legged cowboy's gait. Margaret found herself laughing as they twirled and stepped, the joy of movement and music washing away her worries. They danced 3 songs in succession before Margaret begged a rest, fanning her flushed face. Wyatt fetched them both cups of punch, and they found a quiet spot near an open door where a cool breeze provided relief from the warm barn. "You dance beautifully," she told him. "I wouldn't have expected it." "My mother's influence," he admitted. She was determined her sons wouldn't be complete savages, even in Texas. "Made us learn proper dancing, table manners, the works." "She sounds wonderful." She was. A shadow passed over his face. "Lost her in '65, just after the war ended. Fever took her and my youngest brother both." Margaret touched his arm gently. "I'm sorry, Wyatt. I lost my mother to fever as well 5 years ago." He covered her hand with his own. "Seems we've both known our share of loss." The moment stretched between them, a connection deeper than words. Margaret found herself studying his face, the small scar along his jaw, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the surprisingly long lashes that framed his blue eyes. He was not conventionally handsome, perhaps, but there was a strength and kindness in his features that she found more appealing than any pretty face. The spell was broken by Mr. Redmond's arrival, accompanied by a stately woman Margaret recognized as his wife. "Wyatt, Miss Foster." "Enjoying yourselves, I hope?" "Yes, sir," Wyatt replied, straightening slightly but keeping his hand over Margaret's. "Best dance in 3 counties, as always." "Margaret, dear, I've been meaning to tell you," Mrs. Redmond said. "Your work on the ledgers has been nothing short of miraculous. Richard can actually find things now." The conversation turned to ranch business briefly, then to more general topics. Margaret was just beginning to relax again when she noticed Wyatt's expression change, his eyes fixing on something or someone across the room. Following his gaze, she felt her blood run cold, standing in the entrance to the barn, looking distinctly out of place in his Sunday best, was her father. Jedediah Foster scanned the room until his eyes landed on Margaret. Even from a distance, she could see the rigid set of his shoulders, the disapproving line of his mouth. He began making his way through the crowd toward them. "Wyatt," she whispered, her hand tightening on his arm, "my father is here." Wyatt's expression hardened. He shifted slightly, positioning himself between Margaret and the approaching man. "Mr. Redmond, Mrs. Redmond, would you excuse us? We have an unexpected visitor to attend to." The Redmonds, sensing the tension, nodded and moved away just as Jedediah reached them. "Margaret," her father said, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone she'd heard all her life. "I've come to bring you home." Before she could respond, Wyatt stepped forward. "Evening, sir. Don't believe we've been introduced. Wyatt Harrington, foreman of the Double R." Jedediah barely glanced at him. "This doesn't concern you, Cowboy. I'm here for my daughter." "With all due respect," Wyatt replied, his tone calm but unyielding, "Miss Foster is employed by the Double R Ranch now. She's made her home here." "Made her home." Jedediah's voice rose slightly. "She belongs with her family, not living in sin on some cattle ranch." Margaret felt anger replace her initial fear. "I'm not living in sin, father. I have my own cottage and a respectable position keeping the ranch accounts. And what of that Indian child? You still harboring it?" The contempt in his voice when he spoke of Joshua ignited something fierce in Margaret's chest. "His name is Joshua, and yes, he's with me. He's thriving, which he never would have done if I'd abandoned him as you wanted." Jedediah's face darkened. "You've made yourself a laughingstock, Margaret. The whole town is talking. Come home now and we can put this foolishness behind us. I've arranged for the child to be taken to the mission school in Fort Benton." "No." The word came out stronger than Margaret had expected. "Joshua stays with me. You're being ridiculous. What future can you offer him? Or yourself, for that matter? You'll never marry now, not with this scandal attached to your name." Wyatt, who had been watching the exchange with increasing tension, stepped forward again. "Mr. Foster, I think you should know something." He looked at Margaret, a question in his eyes that she couldn't quite interpret. "Know what?" Jedediah demanded. Wyatt took a deep breath. "I asked your daughter to marry me last week. She did me the honor of accepting." Margaret stared at him in shock. It was a lie, a gallant, unexpected lie meant to protect her reputation. She should correct him, but the words wouldn't come. "Is this true?" her father asked, turning to her with disbelief. In that moment, looking at Wyatt's steadfast face, Margaret made a decision. "Yes," she said, "it's true." Jedediah looked between them, suspicion warring with confusion. "You expect me to believe you're engaged to this?" "Cowhand, foreman," Wyatt corrected mildly. "And yes, sir, that's exactly what I expect you to believe because it's the truth." The music had stopped, and Margaret became aware that many of the dancers had paused to watch the confrontation. Among them, she saw Mr. Redmond making his way toward them, his expression concerned. "Is there a problem here?" the ranch owner asked, his voice carrying the authority of his position. "No problem, Mr. Redmond," Wyatt answered. "Just informing Miss Foster's father of our engagement." Mr. Redmond's eyebrows rose, but to his credit, he recovered quickly. "Well, that's wonderful news. We've all seen how taken you two are with each other." He extended his hand to Jedediah. "Richard Redmond, owner of the Double R, you must be very proud of your daughter, sir. She's become indispensable to our operation." Jedediah, faced with Redmond's obvious status and apparent acceptance of the situation, seemed to deflate slightly. "I wasn't aware of these developments." "Well, now you are," Margaret said, finding her voice stronger with Wyatt and Mr. Redmond beside her. "I've made my choice, father. I hope you can respect it." For a long moment, Jedediah stood silent, his internal struggle visible on his face. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "We'll discuss this further when heads are cooler. I'll be staying in town tonight." With that, he turned and strode out of the barn, his back rigid with disapproval. As soon as he was gone, Margaret turned to Wyatt. "Why did you say that, about us being engaged?" Seemed like the quickest way to get him to back down, Wyatt replied, looking slightly embarrassed. I apologize if I overstepped. It was quick thinking, Mr. Redmond interjected, though perhaps a bit premature. His eyes twinkled with amusement. Margaret felt her cheeks flush. It's not. We haven't. No need to explain, Mr. Redmond said kindly. Family matters are complicated. Now, I believe they're about to start the next set. Would be a shame to waste good music on awkward conversation. With a knowing smile, he returned to his wife's side. The musicians had indeed begun tuning up again. Around them, people were returning to their partners, the brief drama already giving way to the evening's festivities. We should talk, Wyatt said quietly. Outside, Margaret nodded, and they slipped out a side door into the cool night air. The stars spread across the sky in a dazzling display, the moon casting silver light over the ranch buildings. They walked in silence for a few minutes, following a path that led away from the barn toward a small pond. The sounds of the dance faded behind them, replaced by the chorus of frogs and night insects. I'm sorry, Wyatt finally said. I shouldn't have spoken for you like that. You were trying to help. Still, it wasn't right to put you in that position. He stopped walking, turning to face her. Your father's a difficult man, Margaret laughed without humor. That's a generous description. He's rigid, judgmental, and convinced he's always right. What will you do now? He'll be back, you know. I know. Margaret sighed, looking out over the pond where moonlight danced on the rippling surface. But I meant what I said. I've made my choice. Joshua and I belong here now. Wyatt was quiet for a moment, then said hesitantly, what I said in there, about asking you to marry me. Margaret's heart raced. Was he about to propose for real, or apologize again for the lie? She wasn't sure which possibility made her more nervous. It wasn't how I'd planned to do it, he continued, his voice low and serious. Definitely not with an audience, and certainly not as a way to fend off your angry father. Wyatt, he held up a hand. Please let me finish. I know we haven't known each other long, just a couple of months. Some might say that's not enough time to know your own mind or heart. He took a deep breath. But I knew from that first day when I saw you standing on that porch, baby in your arms, chin up despite everything you'd been through, I knew you were special. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as Wyatt took her hands in his. I've watched you these past weeks. Seen how you care for Joshua, how you've made a place for yourself here, how you face each day with courage and grace. And I find myself thinking about you when I'm out on the range, looking forward to seeing your face when I get back to the ranch house. He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, pulling out a small object that gleamed in the moonlight. I've been carrying this around for a week, waiting for the right moment. It was my mother's. In his palm lay a simple gold band with a small pearl set in the center, elegant in its simplicity. Margaret Foster, I'm asking you properly now, with no audience and no pressure, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of letting me help you raise Joshua and any other children we might be blessed with? For a moment, Margaret couldn't speak, overwhelmed by emotion. This man, this good, honorable man, was offering her everything she'd thought she'd lost when she'd chosen to take in Joshua. A future, a family, a place to belong. Are you certain? She whispered. Joshua isn't yours. People will talk. Wyatt's eyes were steady on hers. Let them. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Besides, he added with a slight smile, I already told you that's exactly the kind of woman I want. One with enough love in her heart to care for a child who needs her, regardless of what anyone else thinks. Margaret looked down at the ring, then back at Wyatt's face, earnest, hopeful, and more dear to her than she'd realized until this moment. Yes, she said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. Yes, Wyatt Harrington, I will marry you. His smile was like the sunrise, brilliant and full of promise. Gently, he slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms. When his lips met hers, Margaret felt as though all the broken pieces of her life were finally coming together, forming something more beautiful than she could have imagined. The kiss was tender at first, then deepened with a passion that took her by surprise. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Wyatt rested his forehead against hers. I never believed in love at first sight, he murmured. Always thought it was something made up in those dime novels. But there's no other explanation for how quickly and completely I fell for you, Margaret Foster. I think, she replied softly, that sometimes life brings us exactly what we need, precisely when we need it most. Hand in hand, they walked back toward the barn where the music and laughter continued. Before they reached the door, Wyatt stopped once more. When should we tell folks it's real? The engagement, I mean. Margaret considered this. Let's wait until after my father leaves town. I don't want him thinking he forced this in any way. Agreed. Wyatt squeezed her hand, though it might be hard to keep the smile off my face. Inside, they were immediately surrounded by well-wishers, the news of their engagement having spread through the gathering like wildfire. Mrs. Caldwell, still holding Joshua, pushed through the crowd to embrace Margaret. I knew it, she declared triumphantly. Didn't I say there was something special between you two, and little Joshua here is going to have a proper daddy after all? Looking at Wyatt's face as he took Joshua into his arms, cooing nonsense to the baby who reached for his beard with curious fingers, Margaret felt a surge of love so powerful it nearly took her breath away. This was her family now, unexpected, unconventional, and more precious than anything she could have imagined when she'd stood on her father's porch 2 months ago, cast out for following her heart. 3 days later, Margaret's father returned to the ranch, his manner stiff but less hostile than before. He asked to speak with Margaret alone, and though Wyatt was reluctant to leave her, she assured him she would be fine. They sat in her cottage, the silence between them heavy with years of unspoken feelings. Your mother would be disappointed, Jedediah finally said. She had such hopes for you. What hopes, father? That I would marry some suitable man from town, live a life exactly like hers. Margaret shook her head. Mother taught me to be kind, to help those in need. That's exactly what I'm doing with Joshua. And this cowboy, is he part of your charitable works as well? Margaret felt anger rise in her chest. Wyatt is a good man. He's respected here, has saved enough to buy his own place someday. He cares for Joshua as if he were his own son. He's beneath you. No, Margaret said firmly. He's not beneath or above me. We're equals, partners. That's something you never understood about marriage. You treated Mother like a possession, not a partner. Jedediah looked as if she'd slapped him. I loved your mother, I know you did in your way, but you never respected her opinions when they differed from yours. Margaret softened her tone. Father, I'm not coming back to Silver Creek. I've found my place here with Wyatt and Joshua. I hope someday you can accept that and be part of our lives, but even if you can't, my decision is made. For a long moment, Jedediah stared at her, seeing perhaps for the first time not his obedient daughter but a woman who had found her own strength. Finally, he sighed, a sound of resignation rather than anger. You always were stubborn like your mother. He stood, reaching into his coat pocket to withdraw a small package wrapped in tissue paper. She would have wanted you to have this for your wedding. Margaret took the package, unwrapping it to find her mother's lace handkerchief, yellowed with age but still beautiful. Father, I don't approve, he interrupted, but you're still my daughter. With that, he placed his hat on his head and walked to the door. I'll expect an invitation to the wedding. It wasn't forgiveness or blessing, but it was acknowledgement. For now, that would have to be enough. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, on a perfect summer morning. Mr. Redmond had insisted they use the large lawn behind the main house, where flowering bushes provided a natural backdrop for the ceremony. Margaret wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Redmond and the other ranch wives had helped her make, with her mother's lace handkerchief tucked into the sleeve. Joshua, now 7 months old and sitting up on his own, was dressed in a miniature suit that Wyatt had ordered special from Denver. To Margaret's surprise, her father attended, bringing her younger siblings who embraced her with tears and excitement. Several townspeople from Silver Creek made the journey as well, including Mrs. Abernathy, who wept openly during the vows. I take you, Margaret, to be my wife, Wyatt said, his voice clear and strong as he held her hands before the gathered guests. I promise to stand by you and Joshua through whatever life brings, to honor and cherish you all the days of my life. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Wyatt's kiss was both tender and passionate, drawing cheers from the ranch hands and blushes from the ladies. As they turned to face their guests as Mr. and Mrs. Harrington, Margaret caught sight of her father. Though he didn't smile, he nodded once, a silent acknowledgement that perhaps, in time, might grow into acceptance. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with dancing and feasting under lanterns strung across the lawn. As the night deepened, Wyatt led Margaret away from the party toward their new home, a small but sturdy house on the eastern edge of the ranch property, which Mr. Redmond had given them as a wedding gift. "Welcome home, Mrs. Harrington," Wyatt said, lifting her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. Inside, everything was ready for them: a fire laid in the hearth, fresh flowers on the table, and a cradle for Joshua in the small room adjoining theirs. Mrs. Caldwell had offered to keep the baby for the night, but Margaret had insisted he be part of their first evening as a family. Later, after Joshua was sleeping peacefully and they were alone in their bedroom, Wyatt took Margaret in his arms with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes. "I never thought I'd have this," he confessed, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek. "A wife, a son, a place that's truly home. You've given me everything, Margaret. We've given each other everything," she corrected gently, reaching up to touch his face. "A fresh start, a family, a future." As moonlight spilled through the window, casting silver patterns across their bed, Margaret surrendered herself to her husband's embrace, knowing that the journey that had begun with an act of compassion for an orphan child had led her to the love she'd never expected to find. 2 years later, Margaret sat on the porch of their expanded home, watching as Wyatt taught Joshua to ride his first pony. At 3 years old, the boy was fearless, his laughter ringing out across the yard as the gentle mare walked in a careful circle. "Not too fast," Margaret called, shifting the weight of their 6-month-old daughter in her arms. "Remember, he's still little." "He's a natural, Margaret," Wyatt called back, his pride evident. "Going to be the best rider on the ranch before he's 10. Joshua looked over at her, his face alight with joy. "Look, Mama, I'm riding." "I see you, darling," she replied, her heart full. "You're doing wonderfully." Little Emily stirred against her chest, and Margaret glanced down at her daughter's face, a perfect blend of herself and Wyatt, with his blue eyes and her auburn hair. The baby had been a surprise blessing, arriving just as they had begun discussions about adopting another child from the orphanage in Helena. Life on the ranch had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Margaret still kept the books for the Double R, but now she did most of the work from home, balancing her duties with caring for the children and tending to their growing homestead. Wyatt had been promoted to ranch manager when Mr. Redmond had decided to spend winters in California for his health, giving them even more security and standing in the community. Her father had visited twice since the wedding, each time staying a little longer, his demeanor softening incrementally. He still struggled with Joshua's heritage, but the sight of his grandson fearlessly riding a pony had brought a genuine smile to his face this morning, the first Margaret could remember seeing in years. "Penny for your thoughts," Wyatt said, coming to sit beside her as one of the younger ranch hands took over Joshua's riding lesson. "I was just thinking how fortunate we are," she replied, leaning against his shoulder. "If someone had told me 3 years ago that this would be my life, I never would have believed them." Wyatt put his arm around her, drawing her and Emily close. "Sometimes the best journeys are the ones we never plan to take." Margaret thought of the frightened young woman she'd been, standing on her father's porch with a newborn not her own, cast out for following her conscience rather than convention. How terrified she'd been, how uncertain of the future. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Taking on another man's child, marrying a woman who came with so much complexity?" Wyatt looked at her with the same steady gaze that had first won her heart. "Not for a single moment." He glanced at Joshua, now begging the ranch hand to let the pony trot. "That boy is as much mine as if I'd sired him myself. And you, Margaret Harrington, are the best decision I ever made." As the sun began to set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret offered a silent prayer of gratitude. For the courage to stand by her convictions, for the love that had found her when she least expected it, and for the family that had formed around that first act of compassion, nursing a stranger's child when no one else would. In the distance, Joshua's laughter mingled with the evening breeze, a sound of pure joy that echoed across the land they now called home. Emily's tiny hand curled around her finger, and Wyatt's arm held her secure against his side. Here, in this moment, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true place in the world, not in the rigid expectations of society, but in the boundless love of the family she and Wyatt had created together. "I love you," she whispered, turning her face up to his. "And I love you," he replied, his kiss a promise renewed with each passing day. Forever and always. As twilight deepened into night, stars began to appear overhead, constant, unchanging guides that had witnessed their journey from strangers to lovers to family. Margaret thought of all the twists and turns that had brought them to this moment, all the choices both difficult and joyful that had shaped their path. In the end, it had been worth every step.